opinions, and stories is even more important than ever. While we couldn't host our fourth annual in-person summit this year, we've put together an even better week-long virtual experience that I hope you're enjoying. And for those of you not familiar with Ellevate, we're a coalition of ambitious, supportive women and allies who show up for each other and mobilize to change the culture of business. Because our community is the largest of its kind, we know that navigating a sea of faceless connections is a waste of time. That's why we will always prioritize creating real, authentic relationships that can make a difference in your future. We do this by making sure all of our programming, in person and virtual, and our Signature Squads program are meant to provide you with the opportunity to meet and grow relationships with those who can help you, all while brushing up on topics and skills that are relevant to you. And today, Mobilize Women is no exception. Our capstone event lies at the center of our mission. And it's through Mobilize Women that we take the time to reflect on our own journey, commit to making a mark on our workplaces, and to using our voices and power across the community at large. After all, change doesn't happen magically. It's up to all of us. Now, before we get started, here are a few housekeeping tips, and there will be Q&A at the end. Please use the chat to engage with each other and our speakers. Let's get connecting and sharing. Quote cool things you hear to amplify the message. Drop helpful links to life-changing books, websites, apps, and podcasts. Post your questions in the Q&A box for the moderator to see. Click the CC to toggle the closed captions on, and if need be, you can privately message the Ellevate team. You'll see the Ellevate in our names. We are recording the session and streaming it to Ellevate's Facebook page. And the recording will be available on the Ellevate website for our members to view. In case you missed it, you can now become a free Ellevate member today simply by going to our website, ellevatenetwork.com. And last but not least, please go to Mobilize Women 2020 to have a true Mobilize Women experience. Find Learn, Act, and Engage activities for each session. Share your pics and posts with each other from your part of the globe. And don't forget to use hashtag Mobilize Women to share what you're learning on social media. We're big, we're global, but we're always in this together. Thank you for tuning in, and it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Rumaan Shardi, Global Lead for Responsible AI at Accenture Applied Intelligence, Megan Smith, CEO of Shift7 and former U.S. Chief Technology Officer, and Karen Howe, Senior AI Reporter at the MIT Technology Review. And now over to Karen to kick things off.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Allison. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. I'm super excited to get this session started. So I hope you've been enjoying the rest of Mobilize Women Week this week. And in this session, we're turning our attention to the topic of technology and bias. I was going to let Megan and Rumaan introduce themselves, but Allison did that for me. So I'm just going to dive in. I want to spend the bulk of this session talking about solutions, but before we get there, I want to make sure that we actually get a handle on what we're talking about when we talk about technology and bias. So I wanted to share a recent example of this and why this is such an important issue. Just last week, actually, the UK saw massive protests against a discriminatory exam grading algorithm. In England, when students graduate high school, they have to take a standardized exam known as the A-levels, and their scores on those exams are a major determinant of where they can go to university and whether they can even go to university. And this year, because of coronavirus, in-person exams couldn't happen, so the government regulator ended up deciding to predict the students' scores using an algorithm. And it was an utter disaster. The algorithm disproportionately downgraded students in disadvantaged low-income communities, and it disproportionately inflated the grades of students who attended private schools. And so had students not protested the results and the results were not reversed, then many disadvantaged students would have ultimately had their university offers rescinded. So this is what we mean when we say technology is biased. It's decisions that are made during the process of technology development that codify assumptions from and about specific groups of people and cause the technology to hurt rather than serve those people and fundamentally alter their lives. So, Megan, I gave my example of technology and bias, but I know as someone who's worked across both the private and public sectors, you have many other examples. So I would love to toss it to you for what technology and bias means to you.
Yeah, and I think to me, there's two parts of this. There's what happened there, which is algorithm and data that it learned from, the machine learning bias. But there's also a second part of bias that I want to talk to and expand on, which is what is worthy of work. And so just because it's Women's Equality Day, I'll show you this picture. I don't know if people can see it, it's on my phone, but I just grabbed this just now. This is Ida B. Wells, and this is Union Station. And someone has put an art piece, it's actually a UK artist with others. It's all these different photos of all hundreds of women who worked together across the last many centuries, especially the last two, to get the vote for women and work towards women's equality. And Ida B. Wells, a lot of people don't think of her as a data scientist. They may know of her as a journalist, the amazing woman who worked on justice data and lynching and the challenges in the late 1800s. But I think also not only is there algorithm bias and bias in data sets, but there's also bias in what we bother to do data and algorithmic work around and how we approach it. And so, that we have tons of technical people in government, for example, at NASA or National Institute of Health, and where they should be, but we don't have as many technical people blending in with the other genius skill sets and leadership that we see in HS. Human services like foster care or school lunch, or the Department of Justice or in the State Department. That's a perfect place for a chief data scientist, but that wouldn't be obvious to people. So, and I know, Ruman, you are a genius and knowledgeable about all this stuff and doing a lot of work here. I want to just share a quick screen, if possible. Let's see if we can get this to go. Can you guys see that? See Kathy O'Neill's book. This particular, leader, Kathy O'Neill, has an amazing TED Talk that I encourage everyone to watch, because it shows over and over and over again, Karen, examples that you just shared of just somebody has written an algorithm to decide who goes to jail and how long they stay. Someone has written an algorithm for, and used bias data to figure out like the promotion. Someone has figured out who to hire. Someone like Amazon was working on a machine learning system for hiring, and it started hiring only men. And so I think Kathy is a really great place to get a real feel in this talk for the range of challenges. And of course, Ruman and I work with Joy Buolamwini, who is extraordinary with the Algorithmic Justice League and the new film Coded Bias, but just face recognition, our own faces, that the bias data at NIST and other places doesn't have enough young women of color, right? So, and our phones today, they even when you're taking a photograph, you have to change the setting if someone has darker skin to make the flash work. Like even the technology itself is biased in addition to that. So this is an eye chart. I'm not going to make everyone look at it, but Lauren Smith, when we were in the White House, did some of the amazing work with others, with Nicole Wong and John Podesta, David Edelman, Alex McGilvery, lots of folks, Corey Zarek. We were working on the big data report, also Cecilia Munoz. And so later, Lauren distilled this amazing list of bias. And I sometimes I reflect on this one page, the color page, like loss of opportunity because of algorithmic bias and biased data sets around employment, insurance, getting housing, education access, as we just saw with your example, economic loss, your credit, different prices for different people, narrowing of your choices, not even knowing that something is an option. Then social things like network bubbles, dignity harm, sort of things we see right now in the political world, right? With sort of silos of media, and then algorithms that are serving you more of the same kind of stuff. So you're in an echo chamber and you can't understand the truth. And then loss of liberty, more surveillance for certain people. And in this work, there's mitigation opportunities, including, Ruma, I know you're working on many of these things. So I'm gonna end with like that image, but I think it's important, we'll come back to some more images, to realize the breadth of what's here. And discrimination is not new, it's as old as people. But we have to work on it. We have to work on it in these ways. There's a beautiful Maya Angelou quote that says, do your best until you know better. And then when you do better. Like, it's kind of that simple, right? So how do we get the tech companies, leadership, how do we broaden participation of who's in these teams? And how do we also apply algorithms and data sets and broadening of that on all the problems of the world? How about we work on giving everyone an awesome job that they would love, and those are Department of Labor data sets and that. So it's a big area and it's urgent.
Thank you, Megan. Ruman, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on that question as well. And I see that a lot of the audience loves your background. So, but yeah, what does technology and bias mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, we will get to the Star Trek background as we were talking before we hopped on. I think what I'd add to Megan's, and I'm in complete agreement with everything she said so eloquently, I would also add this notion of agency. And it's not just about bias or harm, that is definitely a big part of it, but also how do we rectify that harm? What are the institutions by which we can say, like, there was something wrong done to me? And it's unsurprising, actually, that some of the first successful litigations against algorithms were done in the public sector, because in the public sector, we have a right to due process. We don't have that right with private companies. So what due process would mean is, okay, and this was an actual case, you get Medicaid coverage because of an algorithm making a decision from some survey that your provider did, your coverage has now been reduced, right? So, in the public sector, I have a right to say, explain to me why this happened. And it was, shown to basically be insufficient to say, well, the algorithm said so. We have no such rights for the tools and products or anything that is used in the private domain or by private entities, which is really interesting because of the ubiquitousness of these technologies. So to what extent can we even opt in or have any agency over choice? And then second is, if something does go wrong, and to be perfectly clear, no technology is perfect. All technology will screw up sometimes, right? Your car will break down at some point, right? Or whatever it is, your computer will get the blue screen of death. And it's fine if you have a way to fix it or do something about it. The thing about all that really stood out to me is the A-level algorithms was that people had to take to the streets. That is a problem. People should not have, we should have the right systems to be able to flag these problems. Another example I'll give will be Apple Card. And for those of you who were paying attention to what happened earlier this year, Goldman Sachs and Apple released the Apple Card. This man and his wife both applied for credit cards. She was denied, he was approved, even though his credit was higher. That is a problem in and of itself. The problem within the problem was when they called customer service to say what happened. The response was, we don't really know, this is what the algorithm decided. That is not a response that people should get, because it removes human agency. There's no sense of redress, and people don't know what's going on. So that's the part I would add to algorithmic bias.
Yeah, I want to return to a point that that Megan alluded to earlier, which is that the root of these problems in part is the data in which these algorithms are trained on, but it's also when people decide in the first place to apply an algorithm to a particular situation. So I was wondering, Megan, if you could expand on that, like how do we end up in these situations in the first place? From the examples that we've listed, it isn't intentional. So where does the fault come from?
I think that, there's so much bias around, like the one I was going to show you, I'll show you another image, I have a bunch of images, but this is one about, actually, I want to go there, hold on a second. This particular one is about film bias. And, oh, I see. So we have these data sets that come from just our behavior, and our world is very biased. Okay, so this particular image that I'm showing you, I show this a lot because it's really quite striking. Can you see this? It's sort of got the blue and red graphic, yeah. All right, so on the bottom, the small one, the bar chart that's going across, that's children's television, men's lines to women's lines. So when we grow up, we learn men speak more and women speak less, because that's the lines that we're given. And often, if women are given lines, they're given less words. People of color are given less words. And so looking, when we grow up, we've grown up in this environment of bias. And so the way we make films is that's men's lines on the left to women's lines in 2000 films. This is the Pudding, which is a data science group doing this reporting. And so, this is really serious. that we train algorithms on this, because we don't want a society like this. So it's challenging. I think the lack, I always study a lot of history, and I look at, what has happened before. And so a couple of things that I would share that I think might be interesting for folks. One of them is that, when we were doing things like, what's worthy of review, here's a hackathon, right? Or the Open Government Partnership, hackathon for foster care. That's not a typical thing to do, but we can be doing that, right? We're often doing self-driving cars or precision medicine or, going to space. These are all incredible topics, and there are others. Think about all the sustainable development goals, justice and peace. Why don't we train on data sets? Sometimes I think we've got these body cams on the police. Why don't we look at all of what happened yesterday and then look at which situations were de-escalated and which situations were escalated, and how can we learn from all the de-escalation and train everyone on those things? And then to our points here, then have humans in the loop to look at, okay, that's not one we want to train on, this is one. And so I would call from history. This is Jane Addams. Again, we're celebrating women today. Jane Addams was considered one of the most dangerous women in the country at one point. She won the Nobel Peace Prize for inventing social work. And she worked in Chicago in the late 1800s and into 1900s in this idea of settlement house. She had data. This is the data teams. This is them in Chicago measuring. They were measuring where people came from, different backgrounds. They were also looking at livelihoods, et cetera. So this idea of social work and data science and data, here's one. This is Grace. She's in 10th grade. She's teaching the police chief how to code here in New Orleans as part of the police data initiative. And there's office involved shooting, use of force data. That's DJ Patel, who came to the White House as the US chief data scientist. And we built a practice, a community of practice of all these different police forces who were learning. Some had already opened data, and like Dallas and others, and then they can learn from each other. Think how we learn, apprentice journey mastery, right? So we have the internet. We can share faster, and we can cross-share in civic tech faster around what works. And we can use feedback, as Ramon was talking about, like how do you interrogate these algorithms and complain and make sure that that comes back if they're discriminating, and that we have not only these topics are here. The last one I would just add here is just a little bit about, the reality of who gets to build things. I was lucky to work at a company called General Magic. It was an early smartphone companies, and we were just, pretty much out of school. I'd gone to Apple Japan for a couple of years, and we got to work with this team. And this team is the Steve Jobs Macintosh team. This is the team that built the Mac. And you see Joanna Hoffman up there on the left. I was had a conversation with her on the makers. And on the bottom in the corner right is Susan Kerr. If you look at the graphics on your phone, anywhere, like her icons, her graphics, her designs are there. Now, this was not a very racially integrated team, obviously, but it is a gender balanced team. And when the movies started coming out, we were surprised because we had worked with this team and all the men had speaking roles and the women in the movies were barely in.
I was about to say, I watched the documentary, Megan. I never knew you worked there.
Yeah, so so we were there, and that this is this Apple team, and Joanna told me that's the purpose of the back of the Mac with the signatures there. She started telling stories about all these different women in the Apple computer team. The head of manufacturing, Debbie Coleman, who had been an English major and figured out how to do manufacturing. We would gain so much confidence from knowing this. And the other story she told, which is really an important story for families, you see the baby there. There was one guy on the team with the baby. They were all pretty young. And Steve Jobs would make him go home for dinner and be home because he thought, and the younger ones in their 20s were like, oh, we got to work more, And so this idea, Steve Jobs is not known as somebody who, it's not part of the ethos of Silicon Valley, of this family idea. So, we have to know the truth. We have to know that the women chemists, we have to know about Ellen Swire Richards and environmental data, because Flint deserved data sets and data science and algorithms, and the people working on these problems and the science of our health, and that deserve to know the history. This was 20 for 2020 we did with Amy Poehler Smart Girls. Our Shift 17 wrote about all these incredible people that, it's like they get almost erased from history. And so if we know the technical women like Ida I was talking about and the Red Record, we should know that she protested with Frederick Douglass, the Chicago World's Fair, where Nikola Tesla got to show off. So if you look at this document called The Reason Why, you will see all these African Americans who should have been having a pavilion at the Chicago World's Fair with their inventions and their creations and their philosophy and art. And so we wouldn't have CES like this, right? So we do not have a pipeline problem, we have a culture problem. And we have to figure this out, and we're making it worse with these algorithms. And we have to look in the past. We have to know Catherine calculated us to the moon and back. You know, Margaret led the software team for Apollo. There were 13 women astronauts together with the 7. And that Ada Lovelace did invent algorithms. At the same time as Darwin thought of our past, she thought of our future, right? So we have to know this truth. And also that just really present, this is the first industrial age, right? Is when Ada and Charles Darwin and these guys are working. It's also when her father, Lord Byron, was with Mary Shelley, who came up with Frankenstein. It's also when Charles Dickens wrote Oliver about child labor and about what kind of working conditions and how do we want to be in the world, right? So think about them, and now we're in the 4th industrial revolution. Let's make it a 4th industrial, inclusive, industrial, civic, you know, environmental, inclusive, green energy, you know, end poverty, civics, and like think about sort of philanthropy revolution, where we really remember the shoulders we stand on, you know, today as we think about all those who have fought for rights, all those who fought for data and inclusion and innovation and solutions. And so that's what I get at as like this tandem goal of both diversifying the teams, but also diversifying the agenda.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Megan. I think that you did such a good job of painting the bigger picture of the phenomenon of erasure of women and the culture problems that we kind of face that are the root in which these technology and bias problems grow from. So Ruman, I was wondering if you could add a little color to that and kind of talk about, you spent a lot of time working with organizations at a very granular level to pinpoint the ethical issues that arise when they're working on developing new technologies and figure out how to stop them from making unintentional mistakes. So what do you see as the common reasons or the common pitfalls that these teams face when they're actually developing these technologies that end up resulting in potential bias?
Yeah, so what a great question. So, you know, Megan is coming forth with like such a noble mission and like a call to action. And then the issue becomes, how do we then start to deliver on this? Like, what do we do to deliver? And I really loved what you were saying, Megan, about like, you know, the bias on what a problem is. I'd even take it to another level and say the bias on how we decide to solve problems. And specifically, like when I think about ed tech, you know, like I've been working in this field for actually a while now, and I've been a data scientist since 2013. And I would say I got the most optimistic and excited about artificial intelligence probably about 2015, 2016, right? And the thing that was the most of interest to me, because I really love teaching, was the concept of ed tech. This was not ed tech. I feel like it is such a disappointing arc, frankly, to have seen what ed tech could have been and what it is today. What it could have been is a radical reimagination of what education is and how students are taught. Because we know that our educational system does not train students for a job. Like the biggest joke coming out of college is no one ever teaches you Excel, right? And yet 99% of job, you know, like, and it's great to have this sort of, we have this like old model of education the way it was as sort of a hobby of the idle elite male, right? And we still structure our elite institutions that way. And that is lovely and noble, but at the same time, it does not get us to like our day-to-day jobs, which very rarely are what we studied in school. So we could reimagine education to be this non-panoptic, non-invasive, non-stressful environment where, you know, and we've seen the empirical evidence from, let's say, Montessori style educations, et cetera, and use that to radically reimagine education with AI, right? And like, this is exactly like, this was what excited me the most. What instead do we see? We see algorithms making arbitrary decisions on students' futures. We see a ton of surveillance-based and invasive technologies where something like, you know, if you look away from your computer, it's going to judge you as cheating. Or if you're looked down or if you're scribbling something during lecture, it's going to say you're not paying attention. Instead, we create this invasive, all-encompassing like technology that literally supports a failed status quo. Why? And that to me is like the biggest disappointment about some of these technologies, is that instead of using it as a radical reimagination, we just kind of use it to like add another brick to the wall. Like, oh, this is what education's supposed to be. You're supposed to be bored and listening to a lecture all the time. And like, you know, oh, but instead we're gonna make technologies to make sure you are paying attention. Not the problem is not the lecture-based boring format. The problem is you, student. And none of our jobs are like that. Nobody who is successful will ever tell you, I sat in lecture and I was an excellent student. Like, for sure, I was terrible at listening to lectures. So like, why don't we do these things? So to your point on specific teams and like what teams can do, and it just seems, so at that level, it seems like a really daunting task. Like, how do we radically reimagine? Like, it's really fun to talk about, but then like, oh, when like the rubber hits the road, you're like, well, what do we do? And that's kind of what I get tasked to do sometimes at companies, you know, and we start from basic principles. We start from helping companies create their fairness and ethics guidelines. And it's really tough because it has to be something that is not overly aspirational, like that is actionable and yet generalizable. So like saying something like, oh, AI should not be harmful is like, sure, like, I don't know, like, what does that mean? I don't know, it means nothing to me. Like, isn't that nice? You know, and at the same time, it is a falsehood because you can't make something that is purely not harmful to everybody all of the time, right? And what is harm? You know, you can fall down this like philosophical rabbit hole. But, you know, we do help companies create these principles, and a lot of companies, these principles are already actually embodied in their code of business ethics and the mission statement. Most big companies have these things written down. So really what I do is I'm like, all right, remember these things that you wrote where you say you uphold diversity, you uphold like all of these standards. Now you action on it with the technology that you build. And the second is, you know, working with teams. So I have a paper coming out that I co-wrote with a colleague of mine at Accenture who's on my team, Bogdana Rakova, as well as Henriette Kramer from Spotify Labs and Jingyi Yang at Partnership on AI. And what we did was we did a survey of people who work these jobs in tech ethics, and we asked them, you know, what are the levers of change you can pull at your company? What are the things that can be done in your organization to really help this prospect of ethical use technology along? And by and large, the big thing that people came back with was we need to have success metrics that reflect impact. They have success metrics that reflect ethics. And this is going to Megan's point about sustainable development goals, right? So a lot of folks who work in impact tech and have these impact-related companies align their business performance indicators to the SDG measurable goals. So instead of being judged on purely profitability and growth, you are also judged based on impact. So like these are the kinds of things we can start moving towards at companies.
Yeah, I think so. At this point, I think both Megan and Roman, both of you have sort of mentioned two really key parts of the solution for how to fix bias. Megan, you talked about bringing in more diverse technologists, more people from other disciplines that are not technology to the table. And Roman, you're talking about how do you create the structural changes within an organization so that once these people come to the table, they actually have the right incentives to succeed in their work and change the culture, change the way that technology is developed. So I want to dig into both of those more. So Megan, coming back to you, a lot of the work that you do with your organization now, Shift 7, is about creating initiatives that empower more diverse technologists and people of other disciplines to come and innovate with each other. So could you talk about some of the initiatives that you're working on right now?
Yeah, I mean, part of the idea, and it really comes out of the experience of working in Roman, one of the things you're talking about, education, this idea of active STEM, active arts, active, you know, we learn to read and we learn to write, right? But when we learn STEM, we have to like absorb all these things. We can't like play and invent. We can't discover. We can't, you know, we sort of can, but it's not the expectation of the curriculum. You're given a lab and this is the answer. And so there's a lot of, you don't get to get the joy. I mean, technology in its greatest form is about love, right? It's about curiosity, obsession, like how does the world work? Why is friction? Like, what is this? Where are we? How are we? How does our brain work? All that. And then it's about engineering, like solution making, right? And you can do really bad things, you can do really good things. So if you're in love form, like solve problems, build bridges, etc. work on green energy, etc. And then community, and welcoming children and all age people into active STEM is really, really important. And so I think the ways to mitigate bias, there's many of them. One of them is to go look for what's already working. So like I'm going to show you, I'm just jumping into these images because it's faster to like kind of just quick show you things. But this is a bunch of couple of images of what active STEM looks like. And, Katie Coleman, who's an astronaut, a friend, we did this video call with these robotics team who are Syrian refugee kids. And we asked them, they were really having a great time doing this. And we said, why are you doing this? And they're like, we got a lot of stuff to rebuild when we get home. And making sure that everybody's getting this kind of confidence building stuff. These are two young people on stage. One of them had built a game. The other one, that's a listening device on the top to listen for domestic violence in your house and be able to call the police. Now, obviously, you would figure out privacy there, but isn't it interesting to be 13 years old, just like Mark Zuckerberg, working on an app as a kid, working on tech? How do you get computer science to be something that's active for all these kids? Or this super cool thing that I love for data, which is called the Data Science Federation. Ramon, it's an homage to Star Trek. And it's an idea of working on your hometown for your homework. And Jean Home, who is a genius data science leader, UCLA faculty, did data.gov with us before I got to government, is now Mayor Garcetti's innovation lead. And so she realized her city teams were like starving for data scientists, and her students wanted more interesting things to work on. So she got the city teams to characterize their problems and put them on the web. And so the students for homework are assigned to make prototypes for them. Design in the loop. And it's not a made up hackathon. It's really real things that matter where you live in LA to work on homelessness or traffic or air quality or, garbage routing or other things. So this idea of active STEM, one of my favorite movies that's come out, Laura Nix did Inventing Tomorrow. Here's a young woman who saw this and then in a science fair kind of spirit, basically goes and starts measuring the lakes. She's in Bangalore and solving those problems. So how do we act the way young people can just come forward, and how do we come up underneath the talented people? And this last image is President Obama's walking up to these kids, and they're in the science fair. There's kids all over. Imagine the White House with kids all over the place with their awesome projects from all over. These kids, this Oklahoma group of kindergarten and first graders, they had made a page turning robot, which is for purpose, right? Something to help people. They're wearing capes, they're doing it together. It's not like one of you's better than the other in math. It just matters. And he says, how'd you guys do this? And they said, we'd had a brainstorming. And then he said, and then what? Then we built some prototypes. So think about that. Like if every child had this kind of experience, just like they learn to read and that kind of joyful learning to read, they would include these topics in everything. And so it's very important that we think about how we're coming in team to solve this problem. And so shift seven means and, if you look at your keyboard, shift to 7 billion colleagues, 7 generations, 7 continents. How about everybody? So we do programs like the United Nations Solution Summit. We just ask who's already fixing the SDGs, and off of the web last year, our 5th year, we got 141 countries, 1,400 submissions in 3 weeks. People are already solving things, and 400 of them were people who wanted to be on the committee to choose. So the volunteer sort of Wikipedia-like power that is humanity that would do these things together.
I absolutely love it. And what I love the most is just this idea of the joy and the wonder behind it. I think, especially in Silicon Valley, but tech, it's like a little bigger than itself, if you know what I mean. And I loved all the pictures you were sharing earlier about, early days, because everyone just seems kind of goofy, right? No one's overly posed or trying to look like a startup leader or whatever it is you're supposed to just kind of just being themselves. And I think sometimes that because of the imagery, that joy gets removed from the experience. And I guess what I'll share is kind of a funny, I suppose I think it's funny now, but by background, my PhD is in political science. So I have been a quantitative social scientist for quite some time. But it was when I came to Silicon Valley to be a data scientist was like 2013, which was the early days of data science. And, you know, I always say I was not born of tech. And what I mean by that is I knew nothing about the culture of Silicon Valley, the mythology. I've never been in an industry where everything was so wrapped up in ideology, mythology, and stereotypes. Like you just like, got a job, right? So I heard about this job called data science. Here I am, like doing my PhD at UCSD, and I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds like a quantitative social scientist to me. I came up here and I was like, why is everybody asking me if I program in Python? Like I can learn Python in like a couple of months. I've been programming since I was 18, but I've done stats programming. I get it, it's on engineering programming, but like, why is this the question? Shouldn't they be asking me like, how do you design experiments, or how would you assess from human behavior whether or not they would purchase something? You know, like these are the questions. So it was very interesting because I came in here purely agnostic, like a complete naive individual. And like, luckily I came in here when I was 33 years old and I didn't get caught up in all of the hype. But I definitely, like today, will be very forward, like I would be very adamant when people ask me the question of, oh, you have an unusual background for a data scientist. I'm like, no, I don't. I have the appropriate background for a data scientist. Because data scientists need to know as much about society and humanity as they need to know about data and programming. Because I would get a lot of that as they go like, oh, can you really program? You're a political scientist. I'm like, yes, we do a lot of coding and programming. So it's like, I love what you're talking about because I genuinely find joy in doing this work. It is genuinely interesting. And I would always say something like, the reason I did political science was it was math with context. And to what you were saying earlier, Megan, like when you're taught in lab or in school, it's like this very narrow, it's boring, it's dry, it's contextless. And the beautiful thing about all of this work with data science, AI, is you solve real problems that affect real people. And that was the cool part to me about political science. This wasn't like abstract human beings, like real census data about real people. You know, and like, sure, you're writing a paper for an academic institution, so it's not necessarily directly going to be used, but that's literally why I moved into data science. I'm like, wait, now I don't have to just like write a paper that floats off into some ivory tower ether. Now I can actually make things that help people's lives. And sometimes that gets a little bit dissolved or removed when we over-intellectualize or frankly overhype what's being built. And this is why I'm so big on agency. So much of like what we build and the language around artificial intelligence acts as if this is like an entity with its own sentience and will, when it is not. It is a function of what we have built. And as human beings, we should take both the responsibility as well as the pleasure in making these solutions. So it's very odd to me that in AI, things are treated like it's like the separate thing, like the AI learned to do X. We humanize it in our language in a way that I actually think is kind of inappropriate.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. And I have one more question for each of you before I want to turn to audience Q&A. So building off of that, Ruman, the point that you were making, one thing that I find interesting about your work is that a lot of companies that are coming to you as the Accenture Responsible AI lead are kind of ahead of the curve in that they already understand that there's something that needs to be fixed, and they already do appreciate the interdisciplinarity that is needed to fix that. But how do you actually, maybe you can start with first an assessment of how much the culture needs to still change for more people to get on board with that message and get on board with that direction, and also how you would go about achieving that kind of shift of mindset.
Yeah, I mean that's a tall order. I mean, I guess the first thing I'd say is, frankly, a lot of clients don't always understand the need for interdisciplinarity, or at least they get the rhetoric. They don't necessarily get how it is doable or actionable. And sometimes it's just a function of organizational structure. Like if you have an overly siloed organization, how do you get people in this department to work with that department? When again, going back to measurement and incentives, you are not necessarily incentivized to, right? If you are working in engineering, your promotion is likely based on things like products you have successfully built and deployed and how successful those products are. It is not in your interest to then go proactively find legal to find problems with ethical issues with what you're building. To be perfectly frank, like we have to be it is great to have broader ambitions, but at the same time, like there are some really practical limitations here. Like most jobs, most technological jobs are not set up so that people want to or are incentivized to find ethical issues and fix them. And that is a job of companies to change. It's really hard to do that. What I'd say is like where I think the change is going to come from, to be honest, I think a lot of the narrative often focuses on big tech companies, and and like rightfully so. But at the same time, our everyday use of data science or everyday use of AI that impacts our lives are not actually by like big sexy companies. It's by like insurance providers, right? It's by some random group you've never heard of called Offqual. It's by some random company called Cambridge Analytica, right? And what will be interesting is to actually spark the change in these other companies, because at the end of the day, like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they're often providers to other companies. And then if these buy, and again, like maybe I'm just like an over, like I did have a subfield in economics and I'm just being overly calculating here, but it does help, it does sometimes help to have a utilitarian framework of like, all right, well, people are utility maximizers. If I'm company X, I'm interested in revenue, among other things. But okay, well, if my suppliers are saying we demand ethical use, well, then I just actually have to go do this thing because I will not get revenue. And actually, I think it's easier to convince companies like, for example, Coca-Cola or Unilever, that ethical use of technology is important to them. So why? Number one, because AI is not precious to them. It is one of many different tools they are using. They see the potential benefit of it. They're like, oh yeah, we can do customer acquisition. More people will buy Coca-Cola. We can customize ads. Are they willing to do it at the expense of their reputation, which for some of these companies, they've been building for almost 100 years? No, they're not. So if I were to go to, let's say, and I'm just throwing out companies that aren't necessarily Accenture clients, et cetera, my clients, but let's say I'm going to a company like Sephora and, someone wants to sell them facial recognition, the example Megan brought up, facial recognition to match you with your makeup. And, if I can adequately show to them that actually the model that you're using will mismatch women of color, they will immediately say, let's not do this, because the last thing we want is to alienate our customer base. We get X amount of revenue from women of color who love our makeup. We don't want the reputational harm. It's just not worth it. So I think the change can actually be driven by regular people and by the companies that would be using the technology. I think, and what's great is when you go to like a Sephora or like a company that serves customers, we are the ones that give them business. We are the ones that are making our economic decisions that impact them. They are actually going to be responsive to us. So it's almost like there's this like chain where, we can have impact in many different ways, but then also there's a really great way for companies that are not native to this technology to be smart about how to use it in a way that then influences like the big industry players.
Yeah, that's a really great point. That I really appreciate that perspective. Megan, last question for you. Putting your former CTO hat on, what kind of role do you think the government should be playing and regulators should be playing in actually trying to facilitate this transformation and make sure companies and other organizations are actually building technology that isn't biased?
I think one of the greatest challenges we have is that people who don't face certain challenges often don't think they exist or don't think they're smaller. Like President Vest of MIT years ago, there was an incredible research that was done by the women science faculty who started to look at the discrimination and bias they faced. And they started to do things like literally like tape measures in their labs to show the difference. All the women seem to have these smaller labs and all the men have these bigger ones, and really getting into the data. And after they wrote this report, President Vest, read it, and he said something like, I always thought that this was part myth and part reality. And now I understand that for the better part, it's mostly reality. And I think part of it is that many people in power haven't had these kinds of experiences that these algorithms are going to discriminate around. And so they have to increase the priority, whether we have to do that through protests, through regulation, through convincing, through making them notice their neighbors and their daughters, and that this has to happen. It's urgent. Now, one of the things we've noticed in the White House is that most companies are talking about diversity and inclusion, but they're doing activities, but I call it RPM, not MPH or KPH. Like they're doing all this activity, but it's not as effective as the work that they're doing on product management or shipping their products. It's not as well honed, it's just not prioritized. And it doesn't mean in every company, there are the heroes who are jamming as hard as they can. I've for myself, I did a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion work at Google, and I almost had to do it in spite of the company, you know, and eventually people would be like, oh, okay. And we would scale it, but it wasn't obvious to people that it was a priority. Like, why are you working on that? But we were able to make women tech makers and many things. So I think the prioritization is the number one move. And I think part of that comes through really sharing exceptional storytelling, like these real examples, and having people wake up and say, wow, okay, I could preside over this problem, and get people's empathy going. And then to Ruma, to your points, like there are really specific things you can do right away. We don't know how to solve this problem. We certainly know how to, we called it raise the floor. Laura Weidman Powers and I wrote a piece in the White House that we collected all the things we could find that were the best practices we had heard around what leaders can do. What can you do in your team? What can you do in pipeline? What can you do in ecosystem? What is the move? What does it look like? How do you measure it? And we made this grid, so we'll post that. But there are moves all over the place, and there are companies and organizations that can help each other. And the senior teams in these companies have to start to care, and they have to be like Chuck Vest and realize it's urgent. It's already happening in their systems. Their brand reputation matters for it. And also they're just going to have more revenue if they do a better job at this stuff.
Absolutely. And what I think sometimes, and maybe I err a little too much on this side, I try to deep pull insides by thinking of other examples. So I love your example of, you know, we build to the problems that we see. So there's this example I started to use after I had this experience. I was in Norway in the winter for a talk. And what I realized was that my iPhone bricked. Like, so I went outside, it was a typical Norway winter. I think it was like 20 below zero. And I just watched as my battery drained and my phone died. And I was like, what's going on? Like, oh my God, what's wrong with my phone? Da, da, da. I show up to the event I'm supposed to be at, and everyone's like, oh yeah, that's normal, that happens. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? Like, yeah, like it's pretty normal. Like in really cold temperatures, your phone bricks. And I'm like, and I thought about it and I'm like, why would they not solve this problem? Well, where's Apple located? In Cupertino, California. So they can build a watch that literally tells you what stroke you are swimming, but they can't build a phone where the battery doesn't break when it's really cold. It's like, we solve the problems that we know. And for sure, none of the engineers who were building, when they were thinking about what are the things we want to build, what's the functionality, right? I am pretty sure none of them had ever experienced a Norwegian winter where their phone bricked, and certainly don't have to do it every day. It was interesting to see all the workarounds people had. They had warmers for their phone. Some of them are like, oh, I just stick it in my jacket under my armpit. They had all this. They had all the like workaround hacks. So like fundamentally, that is a pretty strong product flaw that nobody has addressed. And I can't believe it's unaddressable. Or at the very, you know, it seems to me like, and again, I don't know the intricacies of, you know, batteries, et cetera, but it seems to me that there's something, if it was enough of a problem, it's something that could be resolved. And to the Chuck Vest thing, I think it's really interesting because sometimes, you know, like, yes, data, but sometimes you're like, well, what, do you think women are just complaining? That we've just like been complaining for like 50, 60 or more years? We just like all like to whine about our office space and how our male workers treat, you know what I mean? It's like, so he believed it was a myth of like, oh, okay. So like back to your original statement of like, what do we choose? And I was like, what do we have to prove? So we have to literally measure lab space because you're just not going to believe all of the women that have been saying the same story for a very long time, because I don't know, and, you know, it is also what you measure, how you measure it, who is required to measure and prove and who is not. And back to like the technology we build, there's such a really interesting, like, how do I explain? Like, it's almost like having to prove yourself to the technology in some ways, or if you, to get a desired outcome, to kind of think of how to optimize. So one thing I worry about, especially with a lot of these predictive algorithms, is like, people are smart. We're going to figure out like how to, like, what are the inputs of the system. We already saw it with Google's search engine, right? There are entire companies built around SEO that before, and now like Google has to make incredibly complicated like, you know, like search engine models so that people don't start to game it. So what I worry is that like we will overly datatize or overly quantify what things should be, because all of these things are proxies for other things, right? Like if I'm determining if someone should get a loan, I'm like getting this like qualitative assessment of like someone's credit worthiness. This is actually not an inherently measurable thing. We've invented metrics around it. But then we all learn how to game the credit scoring system so that we know we're going to get a higher credit score, right? Does that mean we are actually more trustworthy? No. So I worry that there's this like over quantification, and then this like, there's this need to have to quote empirically prove everything as if data is better than everything else, like quantified data is better than everything else, which is not true. And then second, that we will overly restrict, and like in a sense, people always talk about like 1984. In a sense, it is in that we are limiting the way we can communicate and speak by having to measure everything. So things are not useful unless they are measurable, is the implicit assumption behind all of these things. And that's, especially when we talk about things like diversity and inclusion or ethics, we're fundamentally talking about non-measurable things. So what do we do about that?
That actually ties perfectly into an audience question. So I want to pose this to both of you. It's from Julia. She says, coming from a background in education and arts, could you speak to the role that arts and STEM, from STEM to STEAM, in helping to reduce bias and build empathy?
Yeah, and I think, Ramon, you were just getting into that. It's like there's so much unmeasurable about the human experience and about what matters and creativity. And also I was thinking as you're talking, like, who's got the measurement, what tool, what yardstick, what thing, who gets to choose, who gets to choose what gets the treasure, who gets the voice, who gets the measure. And we need to step away from that. And I put a lot of different things in the chat, and one of them is Amy Webb, who's a colleague of all of ours, who has written a great book called The Big Nine. Just the introductory chapter of that is really worth, read the book, but if you don't have time, read this chapter, because it speaks to confidence all of us have to scrub into the conversation from all of our different perspectives and all the disciplines we come from, and especially from the arts. I also put Joy Buolamwini's AI, Ain't I a Woman piece, which is an art piece that's an homage to Sojourner Truth, but it's looking at the face recognition technology discrimination that's going on, especially for women of color, and relative to a white male of a certain age who's like 99% recognized versus 70%, right? And I love that piece because she's using poetry and arts and then tech and visual all blended together to really get us to understand and emotionally and intellectually, mind, hand, heart, understand this, which is really important. I'm gonna pop this also in here as again, I'm using history, but it is Women's Equality Day. So for centuries, people worked. I mean, it is incredible that I was mentioning Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Do we raise the monster or not? That's the question. Like, do we? And these are the time when people thought about AI. Ada Lovelace said, I think we can figure out something like the brain of the math of the cerebrum. If we think about it right, the way we figured out astronomy, I wish to bequeath to the generations a calculus of the nervous system. This is the 1800s. And Mary Wollstonecraft, who was the mother of Mary Shelley, died in childbirth. She wrote amazing women rights, the vindication of women's rights. And so we need to keep our confidence. And the reason why I'm sort of going on this is I found something in the Declaration of Sentiments, which is, there were many meetings for equality. One of them was in Seneca Falls. And that's where people work together to ratify a draft policy agenda, and all of these meetings, I included one before it called Pennsylvania Hall, which was much more intersectional, much more interracial. And it was so offensive to everyone, they burned it down in 3 days. And it was building crowdsourcing in the 1800s, but you should know these stories. And the reason why I bring up the sentiments is because the final one, the 18th one that they wrote, or the 16th, says, he has sought to destroy her confidence and get her to lead a dependent and abject life. So this idea of destroying your confidence is something they're screaming at us from the 1800s. And I think that we have to keep our confidence as an artist. Rimon, that was an amazing story of you coming with this perfect background and people like, well, can you code in this language? Like, I can learn that. You know, in fact, like Grace Hopper invented coding languages and they didn't exist before that. And like, women can do these things. Thank you. But it's astonishing, this co-opting of what's important. And this, it's so arrogant and it's so dangerous. And yet it's so blindly done. Our wonderful colleagues, and we love them, but they're really being quite clueless. And some of them obviously are, you know, people like the Cambridge Analytica team did some pretty awful things, but most people are doing it in an unconscious way. That's why I think what we are talking about here, you know, Karen, you're doing amazing reporting, you know, every day at Tech Review on these subjects. How do we get more people who don't see it? Mm-hmm. They think it's part myth before it's too late.
And in some way, it's such a parallel to even just the notion of feminism, right? Like a misunderstanding of feminism is that it's like rah rah, women are better than men, but it's not. Actually, that has never been the definition of feminism. The definition of feminism is about equality, right? And more and more men will say, yes, I am a feminist, but there is certainly still, this concept that, if you are somebody, it is a radical thing to say you're a feminist. That must mean you're like this man-hating, like whatever, like, oh wait, you wear makeup, how can you be a feminist? You know what I mean? Like it's so bizarre, and it's a misunderstanding of what it means to push for equality. And I do agree, Megan, there's so many parallels, because a lot of this ethics work is unintentional and unintended. And it's not just for men. Like, definitely I have worked on like auditing models and auditing algorithms, for example, in hiring, where when I would ask project managers questions about gender bias, I would have women project managers get very offended and say things like, I'm a woman, why would I build an algorithm? Like, why would I lead a project? I'm like, I'm not saying you're doing it on purpose. Like, this is not a judgment of you. This is an assessment of, the data, like, have you taken the appropriate steps? And, it just becomes like, because we're talking about things that are very emotionally charged, people tend to take these criticisms very personally. And it's not, we're not saying you are a bad person because you like neglected to notice that there were no women of color in the room, or that, all the men are speaking over the women, etc. It's just like, take note. And, as the lovely quote that you had in the beginning, like, just do better. That's it. That's all anybody's asking. Nobody wants to, like, forever alienate someone or cancel them or remove them from something. It's just do better. Like see who, like, if the world is truly a meritocracy, then go find the people who are the best, right? And like, and as funny people will say, like, oh, well, like, things are meritocracy, why are we trying to create an imbalanced bias? So now there's this narrative of like counter bias, like, oh, now we're going to over emphasize women and people of color, right? And this sort of this false narrative around that. And it's very bizarre to see that pushback. Because I think it's because people are having these knee-jerk reactions where they're feeling very emotional about these criticisms, and frankly, it's not emotional at all. And going back to like sometimes how I depoliticize these conversations, if I were to tell you that you're building a product that did not address the needs of a particular audience, right? Wouldn't you go and just fix the product? Like, it's just mind-boggling to me how people are totally fine, like, and it becomes my political agenda if I'm saying something should be gender balanced or racially appropriate, etc. And it seems to me like someone else's political agenda if they're going to see a flaw in a product and not fix it. That doesn't sound like a me problem. That sounds like a you problem.
We have a ton of questions that are coming in. A lot of them are asking for practical advice about how to actually fix bias. So I'm going to ask 3 of them that are really interrelated. From Mary, what kind of questions can help us identify and challenge AI bias or other bias embedded in tech? From Yangbo, what are some questions we can ask when it comes to whether or not tech should be built at all? And then from Priyanka, how might we fix the bias in technology with technology? How can we actually help?
I can help with the third one because that's kind of the stuff I do. There's a lot. So one thing I will point you to is NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the US. they have been holding a series of workshops. Last week, there was one on bias in AI. And NIST is actually tasked, by the Office of the President to actually start creating standards and benchmarks for understanding bias. So one of the problems is, we actually have to have like agreed upon standards and norms and ways of assessing. So I would suggest finding the video, and I can find it and post it in the chat, from last week's session, and they're getting very nitty-gritty with asking these questions. So specifically, I was asked a question on, model bias and data bias, and there's a lot to unpack. So it's really hard to answer in the short time that we have. But basically what I'd say is there's data set bias, there's data selection and data cleaning bias, there is model bias in both conception, choice, development, and deployment. And then, again, like to emphasize, I think one really overarching point that both Megan and I have been making, there is what you choose to measure. There is what you choose to be success for the model. And the example I always love to use is people love like talking about how AI goes rogue, and especially in this journey for artificial general intelligence. Karen, I know you and I had this conversation on your short-lived and super fun show. Like often when programmers at a lot of these really great artificial general intelligence places start to try to create AGI, they train them to play video games. And the video games they 99% of the time train them to play are like zero-sum games, like shooter games or racing games. But that's actually not how society works. Society works in a collaborative fashion. So why not train an AGI that learns to play Stardew Valley or Animal Crossing, or a game in which the purpose is sharing, collaboration, and getting along, which is actually how humanity works. If we are going to achieve AGI, we don't like win at life. You don't get a certificate once you cross the line. Like you muddle through and you do your best, and that's what life is. So if we're gonna make AGI, it's actually based on collaborative behavior, but it's the problems we choose to solve.
Megan, do you want to answer one of these three? What questions can we help to identify bias? What questions can we ask to make sure we're not building technology that just shouldn't exist? And how do we actually use technology to fix bias?
By the way, Katarina Fake has that fabulous podcast, Should This Exist? They discuss a lot of things like that. Like some of the tracer tech around COVID should not exist. Gene Holmes always talking about, human plus machine, many of those things there, because people will later use it for tough things. Mm-hmm. I think, NIST is a wonderful resource. And we also have to hold NIST accountable because sometimes they have biased data sets. NIST is this amazing, when you go in the government, you find all these things like the people who know exactly what time it is. They're the team that keeps the standards for ladders and do like everything. So we need to have these standards. And so this kind of training is there. The partnership on AI. Tara was in our team at the White House. We did a lot of work for President Obama. And obviously the Trump teams continue. It's really important for our country. I remember we sent the first memo up to President Obama, and people said, generalized AI is not here yet, but narrow AI in different forms, machine learning is here. But we don't know, maybe decades. President Obama wrote, that's not too long from now, let's get ready. So he sent back the memo and said, let's go. So we really started to get in what you're talking about, a dialogue, ecosystems. We need to do this together. And we can use collective genius to see where problems are emerging and iterate quickly as possible. It's really urgent. So I think that's there. I want to show you a really cool, if we have a second, possibility for, one way to mitigate bias. I showed you guys that image of media. And I had the wonderful chance of interacting with Gina Davis, who's gender and media. And so this is an image from Star Wars. It's just a basic pie chart of who gets to speak. But the green is men's lines to women's lines in yellow. And then you see in the 1977 Star Wars, again, all race, all Caucasian, then Force Awakens and Rogue One begin to get better, right? So this was a team that was doing this measurement, and this is some of their work.
Yes, sir.
It's using face recognition technologies, Siri, Alexa, natural language processing to see, what is happening here. So we can see, you know, in this scene, they want to show intimidation, right?
Like you said, it's classified.
And so we're able to see that the white faces are all looking at this one woman, you know, African-American woman. She's got to see the power play here.
To the light.
So, you know, just it's possible to use AI and technologies to help ourselves. So could we use this not to boss Hollywood around? We want them to be as genius and creative as possible. But can we make tools that help you when you're writing your script, when you're doing the dailies, when you're in the editing room? Was that your creative intent? Or did you mean to have one group have very diminishing lines or one group to be in the screen? So this is the kind of field that I think we're calling for, which is, where is the tech for like hack the pay gap, which some of the presidential innovation fellows did. That was fabulous, right? Data science for the pay gap and apps and tools to help with the pay gap, in addition to critical tools like protest and business change. So think about what are you trying to do? What do you wish was true in the world? And then don't think like there's a bell ringing between your high school subjects and you have to divide them up and you're only good at art, or you're only good at math, or you're only good at this. Like, use them all. And if you don't like some of them, there's lots of teammates. And let's like power up on the things that really need urgent solving. We don't, and back to that video game point, there was a hackathon or a wonderful palooza of all these people who had made education games. And one of them was making this new, you know, like one of those ecosystem building. And all the kids would come and make the shark wolf. You know, you could make it whatever combo animal you wanted, and it would destroy everything. So instead, people like realized like, okay, let's chill it out a little bit. We can have some of this. But how do you think in an ecosystem way? We're on a living planet. You know, we're in the middle of climate change. What can we do today with data science and teamwork and this amazing network that we've built to really have thriving sustainability, and think about that in that way, you know, which is our opportunity.
Thank you both. I have one more question from the audience, and then I have one question myself. So the question from the audience from Tova: innovation thrives when products are relentlessly prioritized so that the MVP is lean and can be shipped quickly. What are your thoughts on the seemingly inverse relationship between this quick innovation and actual inclusive building for all use cases? And let's have maybe 1 minute from each of you on that.
Sure. I mean, I guess my take is that I think it's actually a false dichotomy and a false setup. I don't know why I like very aggressively need like an app to walk my dog tomorrow. I don't think that, you know, and I think like part of the issue is the framing that this isn't part of an MVP. Diversity and inclusion or ethics comes later. We'll worry about that later. What's critically important is that this app is standing, that the, you know, the user interface is working. The rest of it's kind of like hand wavy. I think that is a false dichotomy that's been set up. It is like, that's like my kind of initial take. Like, number one, there are a few technologies that are so critical that it can't undergo ethical review, because frankly, most of the technology that comes out of Silicon Valley isn't like literally saving someone's life tomorrow. So unless you can make the case that what you're building needs to be standing, and even then, like if it's saving someone's life, then you actually have more of an imperative for an ethical review, because whose life is it not saving, and how is it prioritizing what lives it chooses to save? That would be the first. And again, like that being framed in that manner already diminishes the role and importance of ethical use, which really should just be part and parcel of how these things are thought of by design. The second thing I'd say is, you know, sometimes it's okay to do things deliberatively and slow. Like, it's a nice thing actually to be thoughtful, because if you think about how many times in your own personal life you have rushed to do something and spend more time fixing the things you screwed up because you rushed, right? And like, if you think about it that way, I don't know if it's like so critically important or of utmost importance to not take the like extra time to do something well. And again, this is assuming something will take extra time. I don't actually know. I don't even necessarily think it's true. I think there are ways of actually building these into your design and development processes, because QA is a standard part of engineering and design processes. So building in a good QA process and reducing the inefficiencies around how ethical work is being done will actually go a really, really long way.
Megan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I totally agree with everything you just said. And I think the only area I've ever, like in hiring, people are in such a rush and the networks are so dysfunctional of who knows who, that's an area that if you just slow down a little bit, you will find genius talent that you might not have found before. And if you've done that and you've really diversified your teams, you can actually move a bit faster because you won't have one group trying to build something for everybody else. You'll just have everybody building stuff for everybody. And so that can really help you. So I think that's there. Also, there's many different business models. And so there's commercial tech, but there's also civic tech, there's nonprofit tech. Claire Barton certainly, in making the Red Cross, was using something that was blitzscaled. And it wasn't a commercial thing. So you should think about careers and business models and where treasure is, and how we can use large budgets that we have that might be in a different sector and dust them off and upgrade them. Like a lot of stuff sits in the Pony Express and we have the Telegraph. Lincoln did that, he upgraded tech. And so we have to do that too. And so teaming up that way is, matters a lot.
I have one more question for each of you, really quick. As a final closing thought, if I could get one sentence, what advice would you give to members of our audience today about the one thing that they can start doing tomorrow to help fight bias and build more inclusive technologies? Ramon, do you want to start?
Sure. I would say ask questions. Ask questions of everything. Question all of it. Question how your teams are constructed, who gets to decide what's being built, who gets to decide what models are being chosen. I think you have every single right and to ask questions. I love Megan's last point. Like when I first started in data science, you really could only do that job up here. Now you can do that job in just about every industry, in just about every corner of the world. You don't have to be here. You don't have to work at a big tech company. You don't have to have ethical trade-offs in what you're doing. And it's amazing to see more and more companies and organizations trying to build tech using cool technologies and doing it in a way that will, can be in alignment with ethical values.
Megan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, very much so. I think that exactly asking those questions, and one of the surface area ways to do that, Lou Gerstner, when he was turning around IBM, did a really interesting thing with his executive team, where he knew that his team wasn't immediately diverse at the time. It's the 90s, it's IBM, somewhat diverse, but not much. And so he realized he had tons of talent already at IBM, but he didn't have a way to talk to them all the time. And so they had 8 employee resource groups at the time, veterans, African-American, women, Hispanic American, all the different groups. And many companies have employee resource groups. And what he said to his executive team, he said, I want you to get together with these groups, be not only exec sponsor, but go to 2 of their events every quarter. And I want you to give them budget. And I want 4 questions asked as this group gathers of IBMers. And I want to know, how do I get more customers, employees, and suppliers from the community you're from? And how do I make sure you thrive at IBM, whether it's into a technical path, they have the technical path, the management path, however you want to be. And the answers were astonishing and valuable. And the executive team actually heard them rather than it kind of never getting to them because of the connections he made. And he put it as a standing item on the, just a standing item on the regular executive agenda for the weekly executive meeting at the C-suite level. And it changed IBM. And it was a big part of the turnaround because they got more collective genius. So I think that moves like this in terms of broadening the surface area of what the leadership team is hearing and what each other are hearing, and then very specifically as it relates to AI and bias, you can run those questions through those channels and begin to see extraordinary things. Who's being harmed by stuff. Kodak, who we love, like Kodak, great American company. I'm here in Western New York, so I think Kodak and Corning stayed at the table, Kodak not so much. But maybe this is part of it. They had a thing called the Shirley card, and all of their photography, their chemistry worked for that card. But the card was wrong. Like they made a mistake. And so all their chemistry was light balanced to light skin. And so they never could have photographs of darker skinned people that worked with the same kind of quality. And so, what a mistake. And yet what happened, sadly, Joy Buolamwini started this story, when the chocolate companies and the furniture companies came complaining about their photography for the advertising, they fixed it. So it was totally fixable. It just was not a priority, how offensive and just awful. And so we can fix this stuff. We just have to kind of, to our quote, wake up to it, know that privilege has been there for some, and do it sooner than later because it's really urgent.
Thank you so much, Megan and Ramon, for your wonderful wisdom today. And thank you to our audience for joining us. And at this point, I realize we're a little bit over, but I'd like to hand it back over to Allison to close out the session. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Oh, there we go. There's my video. What a fascinating discussion. Thank you, Ramon, Megan, and Karen. Thank you to all of you that tuned in, and huge thanks to our sponsors, RBC Wealth Management, Accenture, Guardian Life, Lincoln Financial Group, Unilever, NFP, Baker Hostetler, Columbia Business School, London Stock Exchange Group, Fiera Capital, and MM LaFleur. We greatly appreciate all of your support. We wouldn't be able to do the work that we do without all of you that are participating today. So thank you again. And these conversations matter more than ever before. We want to reach as wide as an audience as possible. After all, there is strength in numbers, and together we can change the world. Now, remember, there are only 2 more days left in Mobilize Women Week, which is hard to believe. I'm having a blast. I hope you are too. Our next session is tomorrow at 1 o'clock Eastern, Women in Politics 100 Years Later, featuring remarks from Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and one-on-one interviews with Bushra Amiwala, the youngest Muslim elected official in the US and Glamour College Woman of the Year, Christine Hallquist, CEO at Cross Border Power and the 2018 Vermont Democratic Governor nominee, Shaniqua McClendon, Crooked Media's political director, which all will be moderated by Aditi Janeja, Counsel at Protect Democracy. So mark your calendars, invite your friends, spread the word on social media using hashtag Mobilize Women, and show us some love. Lastly, don't forget to visit our experience page at mobilizewomen2020.com to get more insights and tools to turn today's discussion into action. In the spirit of taking action, we've partnered with the Civic Alliance, a growing nonpartisan network of more than 130 member companies that have come together to champion civic participation, meet the unique challenges of the 2020 election, and build momentum for a higher voter turnout this November and beyond. So remember, your voice and your vote matter. Text Mobilize 26797 to get help registering to vote, make a plan to vote, and keep track of voter deadlines. Thank you so very much, and we hope to see you tomorrow.